Imagine sitting down to dinner in the Middle Ages. There is bread on the table, a joint of meat, perhaps a stew bubbling in a pot. You reach for your fork, except you don't. Because in much of medieval Europe, the fork was considered suspicious, decadent, even downright scandalous. What you really needed at the table was a knife, some bread, and, if you were fortunate, a spoon. The spoon might seem the least glamorous of utensils. Today it lives in the cutlery drawer, jostling with forks and butter knives, rarely noticed. But in the medieval world, the spoon was something altogether different. A practical tool, a personal possession, a marker of status, and at times, even a treasured heirloom. The earliest medieval spoons were made of what was on hand: wood, bone, or horn. Peasants carved them themselves, sometimes crudely shaped, often handed down from parent to child. But wealthier folk? They dined with spoons of pewter, silver, or even gilded metal. A silver spoon was not only more durable, it was a visible sign that you belonged to a class who could afford refinement. This is where we get the phrase, "born with a silver spoon in your mouth." It was not simply a metaphor for wealth. Silver spoons were often given as baptism gifts, intended to mark a child's welcome into the world with prosperity, and, if you were practical, something useful. So how did people actually use their spoons? To understand that, you have to imagine a medieval table. Plates, as we know them, were rare. Instead, people ate off trenchers, thick slices of stale bread that soaked up the juices from stews or roasts. Your knife, carried on your person, often in a sheath at your belt, was used to cut food. Your spoon? That was for anything soft, wet, or soupy. Porridge, pottage, broth, sauces. These were the everyday fare of peasants and nobles alike. Without a spoon, you were in trouble. And unlike knives, which you carried, spoons might not be provided by your host. Travelers often brought their own. Some even kept theirs hanging from their belt, much like a pocket knife or a wallet today. The spoon was not just a tool. It could be an object of prestige. Wealthy households had ornate spoons engraved with initials, crests, or decorative handles, lions, fleur-de-lis, or biblical figures. Monks and priests had regulations about which spoons could be used in refectories, lest dining become too luxurious. And in some households, a spoon could be so personal that losing it was a real embarrassment. Think of the spoon as halfway between jewelry and a smartphone, practical, personal, and quietly status-defining. Now, about that fork scandal. Forks were known in parts of the Byzantine world as early as the 10th century, and Italian elites picked them up later. But many Europeans viewed them with suspicion. A Venetian princess who brought her forks to court in the 11th century scandalized her hosts. Churchmen muttered that God had given us fingers, and to pierce food with tiny prongs was both decadent and effeminate. Even in the Renaissance, some critics still called the fork a sinful luxury. And so, for centuries, spoons were the trusted companion at the table, while forks lingered in the shadows. If you were a peasant, your spoon was likely rough, maybe even shared between family members. But if you had means, your spoon might travel with you through life. A silver baptism spoon could be polished, carried into adulthood, perhaps even passed to your children. It might be the one object you could count on in a world where possessions were few. The simple spoon was also a gift. Godparents gave them at christenings, lords presented them to favored retainers, and monasteries sometimes handed them out as tokens. They weren't just about eating, they were about belonging. By the late medieval and early modern period, the fork would finally creep onto tables, and the spoon would lose its crown as Europe's indispensable utensil. But for centuries before that, it was the silent ruler of the meal, the bridge between hand and mouth, the little object that told you everything about class, culture, and custom. So next time you reach for a spoon, think of it as a medieval heirloom, the friend of peasants and princes alike, the object you'd never leave home without. Because in the Middle Ages, if you wanted to eat, and eat well, you needed your spoon. If you enjoyed this look at the humble spoon, join us again for more medieval stories. Subscribe to History in Chainmail and keep your utensils ready. There's plenty more to taste from the past.